Lieutenant Armin Faber circled his Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighter through the summer sky over the English Channel on June 23, 1942. His heart hammering against his ribs as sweat dripped into his eyes despite the freezing altitude, because moments earlier he had just become Germany's newest ace by shooting down 2 British Spitfires in a dogfight so violent and disorienting that he'd lost complete track of which direction was home and which was enemy territory. And now, with his fuel gauge dropping toward empty and his hands trembling on the control stick, he made a decision that would change the course of World War II in ways he could never have imagined. He would land at the nearest airfield, get his bearings, refuel, and return to France a hero. The FW-190 was Germany's most jealously guarded secret, a fighter so advanced that it had sent shockwaves through the Royal Air Force when it first appeared over France in September 1941, outperforming the legendary Spitfire Mark V in nearly every category. Faster in level flight, faster in a dive, better rate of roll, better armament, better visibility from the cockpit, and the British had been desperately trying to capture one intact for nearly a year, sending commandos on raids, offering bounties to resistance fighters, even contemplating a full military operation to seize a German airfield, all without success, because the Luftwaffe had strict orders to destroy any FW-190 that crashed on enemy soil and never, under any circumstances, to let one fall into British hands. Faber, a 23-year-old veteran of the brutal air war over France and the Low Countries, had been flying this particular aircraft, work number 313, for 3 weeks and knew every quirk of its Bavarian Motorworks radial engine, every rattle in the cockpit, every degree of play in the control surfaces, and he loved this machine the way a knight loved his warhorse. It had saved his life twice. Once when a Spitfire had gotten on his tail and the FW-190's superior roll rate let him snap into a hard left turn that no British pilot could follow, and once when a damaged cooling system should have seized the engine but the BMW 801's robust design kept it running just long enough to get him home. Now, as he descended through patchy clouds toward what he was certain was the French coast, Faber ran through a mental checklist of the engagement that had just cost 2 British pilots their lives and nearly cost him his own. The initial bounce on a flight of 4 Spitfires returning from a sweep over France, the snap decision to attack despite being outnumbered, the first Spitfire breaking apart under his 4 20mm cannons and 2 7.92mm machine guns, the second pilot's desperate defensive spiral that ended when Faber anticipated the British pilot's next move and fired a 2-second burst that stitched holes from cockpit to tail, the violent evasive maneuvers as the remaining 2 Spitfires turned to avenge their comrades, the negative G pushover that made his vision gray and his stomach heave, the clouds that saved him when he ducked into their concealing embrace, and finally the disorienting minutes of blind flying that had left him uncertain of his position but confident that he was heading south toward safety. The runway appeared below him. A beautiful ribbon of concrete that meant survival, hot coffee, a debriefing, and perhaps a medal. And Faber dropped his landing gear, reduced throttle, adjusted his trim, and made what he would later describe as one of the smoothest landings of his career, the tires kissing the runway with barely a squeak before he deployed his tail wheel and began rolling toward what he expected to be German ground crew with fuel trucks and smiling faces. Instead, he saw a Spitfire parked on the tarmac, then another, then an entire row of them, and the ground crew running toward him weren't wearing Luftwaffe gray but Royal Air Force blue, and the vehicles racing down the runway behind him weren't German trucks but British lorries filled with soldiers pointing rifles at his canopy. And in that single crystallizing moment of horror, Armin Faber realized that the disorienting dogfight had rotated him 180 degrees without his knowledge, that he had flown north instead of south, that the coastline below him had been Wales instead of France, and that he had just landed at RAF Pembrey, a frontline fighter station, in the most advanced German fighter aircraft in existence, gift-wrapped and fully intact, with every secret of its design, every technical innovation, every tactical advantage now available for British engineers to study, copy, and counter. The RAF personnel approaching his aircraft couldn't believe their luck. They had been hunting this exact plane for months, had lost pilots trying to force FW-190s down intact, had offered bounties and run intelligence operations and prayed for a miracle, and now one had simply landed at their airstrip because a German pilot had gotten confused during a dogfight, and as Faber slowly raised his hands and felt the cold touch of British air on his face when they forced open his canopy, he understood that he had committed the single most catastrophic blunder of his military career, a mistake so profound that it would echo through the remainder of the war and haunt him for the rest of his life. Within hours, work number 313 was surrounded by armed guards and covered with tarps as Air Marshal Sholto Douglas, commander of RAF Fighter Command, was awakened with news so extraordinary he initially thought it was a joke, and by dawn the aircraft was being carefully transported to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, where Britain's top test pilots and aeronautical engineers waited with barely contained excitement to examine the machine that had been terrorizing their Spitfire squadrons for nearly a year. Squadron leader Philip Toosey, who would later become famous for his role in building the bridge over the River Kwai, was among the first RAF officers to interview Faber, and he found the young German pilot utterly despondent, chain-smoking cigarettes and staring at the wall with the hollow eyes of a man who has lost everything, because Faber knew that his career was over, his reputation destroyed. His name would become synonymous with failure, and worse, he had potentially cost Germany the air superiority it desperately needed to maintain control over occupied Europe. The British immediately understood the goldmine they had stumbled into. The FW-190's BMW 801 radial engine was a masterpiece of engineering, designed to be simple, rugged, and powerful, producing 1,700 horsepower through innovative fuel injection and a highly efficient cooling system that eliminated the vulnerable radiators of inline engines like the Merlin powering the Spitfire, and the wide-track landing gear made the FW-190 far more stable on the ground than British fighters, while the heavily armored cockpit and self-sealing fuel tanks gave it survivability that shocked RAF pilots who had pumped multiple magazines into FW-190s only to watch them limp home. Captain Eric Winkle Brown, the Royal Navy's chief test pilot and one of the most experienced aviators in Britain, was given the honor of first flight in the captured FW-190, and he approached the aircraft with a mixture of professional curiosity and genuine nervousness, because this was the fighter that had been consistently outperforming every aircraft the RAF could field, and he needed to understand exactly why that was happening, what advantages it possessed, and critically, what weaknesses British pilots could exploit to stay alive in combat. Brown's first impression upon climbing into the cockpit was how ergonomically advanced it was compared to British designs. German engineers had positioned every control within easy reach. The instruments were logically arranged and easy to read. The visibility was outstanding with a bubble canopy that gave nearly 360-degree views, and most impressively, the FW-190 featured an advanced engine management system that automated mixture control, propeller pitch, and supercharger activation, allowing the pilot to focus entirely on fighting rather than constantly adjusting engine settings like Spitfire pilots had to do. When Brown fired up the BMW 801 for the first time, the entire aircraft shook with barely contained power, the engine note deeper and more visceral than the high-pitched scream of the Merlin. And as he taxied out to the runway, he noted how the wide landing gear made ground handling remarkably easy compared to the Spitfire's narrow track that had killed numerous inexperienced pilots in ground loops. And when he opened the throttle for takeoff, the acceleration pressed him back into his seat with authority that made him smile despite himself. This was an extraordinary machine. Brown's flight test revealed exactly why Spitfire pilots had been dying in alarming numbers. The FW-190 could outroll any British fighter by a factor of 2 to 1, meaning that in the split-second decisions of dogfighting it could change direction twice as fast. The dive performance was superior due to the radial engine's resistance to negative G fuel starvation that plagued the Merlin. The rate of climb below 20,000 feet was better than any mark of Spitfire currently in service. And perhaps, most devastatingly, the armament of 4 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns delivered 3 times the weight of fire of a Spitfire Mark V, with far more destructive power. A 2-second burst from an FW-190 could literally tear a Spitfire apart, while it took sustained fire from the Spitfire's 8.303 machine guns to bring down the heavily armored German fighter. After landing, Brown submitted a report that sent shockwaves through fighter command. The FW-190 was not just slightly better than the Spitfire Mark V, it was overwhelmingly superior, and unless the RAF could field new aircraft or develop tactics to counter this advantage, German fighters would achieve air superiority over Western Europe, making any cross-channel operations, including the planned invasion of France, potentially impossible. Faber's navigational blunder had given Britain the information it desperately needed to survive the air war, and within weeks, RAF tactics began to change based on what Brown and other test pilots learned from flying work number 313. British pilots were instructed to avoid turning dogfights with FW-190s where the German fighter's superior roll rate gave it an advantage, and instead to use the Spitfire's tighter turning circle at high altitude where the FW-190's performance degraded. to attack from above and use dive-and-zoom tactics that didn't allow the FW-190 to bring its guns to bear, and critically, to always maintain altitude advantage because the FW-190's climb rate above 20,000 feet was noticeably worse than the Spitfires. Even more importantly, the captured FW-190 accelerated British development of the Spitfire Mark 9, which featured the more powerful Merlin 61 engine with a two-stage supercharger that finally gave the Spitfire performance parity with the FW-190, and the Hawker Tempest, which was specifically designed to counter the FW-190's strengths, and both aircraft would prove decisive in eventually wresting air superiority back from the Luftwaffe over the beaches of Normandy in 1944. Meanwhile, Faber sat in a prisoner-of-war camp in Canada, cut off from news of the war and unaware of the full consequences of his mistake, though he suspected from his interrogators' barely suppressed excitement that something significant had happened beyond just his capture, and he was right. The intelligence derived from work number 313 was considered so valuable that Winston Churchill personally ordered that news of the capture be suppressed for as long as possible to prevent Germany from modifying tactics or design if they knew the British had a complete FW-190 to study. German intelligence eventually learned through various sources that an FW-190 had been captured intact in Britain, but by then it was too late. The damage was done, British pilots were exploiting the FW-190's weaknesses, new aircraft were entering service to counter it, and the technological advantage Germany had enjoyed was evaporating rapidly, all because a skilled and experienced pilot had made a simple navigational error in the confusion of combat, proving that wars are not just won by advanced technology and brave soldiers but can pivot on single moments of human fallibility. After the war, when Faber was finally repatriated to Germany, he found himself in the awkward position of being simultaneously admired for his combat record. He had 8 confirmed kills and the Iron Cross, and quietly blamed for one of the Luftwaffe's most embarrassing intelligence failures, and he rarely spoke about the incident publicly, preferring to let historians and aviation enthusiasts debate the significance of what happened on that summer day in 1942. Modern analysis suggests that while Faber's blunder certainly accelerated British countermeasures, the FW-190's technological advantage was likely temporary regardless. Aircraft design was advancing so rapidly during World War II that no single fighter maintained superiority for more than a year or two, and British engineers were already working on improved Spitfire variants before they captured work number 313. So perhaps Faber's mistake shortened Britain's disadvantage by 6 months rather than changing the ultimate outcome of the war, though 6 months in wartime can mean thousands of lives saved or lost, so the significance should not be understated. The story of Faber and his misplaced FW-190 has become legendary in aviation circles, taught in military academies as a cautionary tale about situational awareness, navigational discipline, and the fog of war, and work number 313 itself survived the war and was eventually returned to Germany, where it now sits in the Luftwaffe Museum in Berlin, polished and pristine, a testament to German engineering excellence and a reminder that even the most advanced technology is only as reliable as the human operating it, and that sometimes the most consequential moments in history arise not from grand strategic decisions or heroic sacrifices but from simple, honest mistakes made by ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, doing their best to survive another day in a war that asked too much of everyone it touched. Faber lived until 1976, dying at age 57, having spent 3 decades processing his role in this strange chapter of history, sometimes bitter about the unfairness of being remembered primarily for a navigational error rather than his combat successes, but ultimately philosophical about the incident, recognizing that fate and circumstance had conspired to put him in an impossible position where the disorientation of combat flying, the similarity of the British and French coastlines, and the universal phenomenon of thinking you know where you are when you actually don't, had combined to create a perfect storm of confusion that could have happened to any pilot regardless of skill or experience. The broader lesson, understood by aviators ever since, is that spatial disorientation is one of the most dangerous threats in combat flying. Your inner ear lies to you, clouds erase all references, adrenaline narrows your perception, and the intensity of life-or-death maneuvering makes it terrifyingly easy to lose track of basic facts like which direction you're facing, and even today, with GPS and advanced navigation systems, pilots still occasionally make versions of Faber's mistake, though rarely with such consequential outcomes because modern aircraft are less jealously guarded secrets and modern wars are less existential struggles where a single tactical advantage can shift the balance of entire campaigns. Yet the story endures because it captures something fundamentally human and relatable. We have all experienced that sinking feeling of realizing we're completely lost, that our confident sense of direction was entirely wrong, that we've been proceeding with certainty toward disaster, and in that moment of recognition we understand exactly what Faber felt as those British Spitfires came into view, and he knew with absolute clarity that everything had gone catastrophically, irreversibly wrong, that there was no escape, no excuse, no way to undo what had just happened, only the cold reality of consequences that would ripple forward through time, affecting people and events he would never meet or witness, all because he turned left when he should have turned right, because he trusted his instincts instead of his instruments, because in the chaos and terror of air combat he made a simple, understandable, utterly human mistake that just happened to occur at the worst possible time, in the worst possible place with the worst possible aircraft, creating one of World War II's most bizarre and consequential accidents, a gift-wrapped intelligence coup that Britain desperately needed and Germany could ill afford to give, delivered not through espionage or military action but through the universal experience of being lost and making the wrong turn home.